afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the third episode of Uncommon Voices, Uncommon Visions. I'm Dr. Valerie Nyberg, your host. I was supposed to have Miss Sarah Swayze with Empowering Youths of Iowa with us today, but she wasn't unable to make it. Instead, I'm really happy to announce that I have Pete Clancy. He is the South Central UNICEF representative for the Iowa State Education Association. He is also currently a doctoral student at the University of Iowa in the Schools, Culture, and Society program with a focus on the history of education. Pete and I go way back to when I first became an administrator at Cedar Rapids, Washington High School. So I'm super excited to have him on today's episode. The title of today's episode is Education Culture Wars. So Pete, you've been a high school teacher and now work with the ISEA. How have you come to this topic of the culture wars as they play out in our schools?
Well, thank you for having me, Valerie. I'm also very excited to be here with you.
Thank you.
And so the culture wars is, we're experiencing it right now in education particularly. And so it just seemed like a very relevant and timely topic. It's also kind of very close to my heart in terms of my research interests in my doctoral program. And for some kind of background, I grew up in Ankeny, Iowa, and graduated from high school there. And when I graduated from high school, there were fewer than 5 students of color in my graduating class. I mean, Ankeny was and still is a very white suburban school or city and school district in central Iowa.
What year did you graduate?
2003.
Awesome.
Oh, and so I didn't necessarily get kind of exposed to the wealth of diversity that there is in the world. That is not to say I had a bad experience in Ankeny or anything. I'm still very proud of the education I got through Ankeny Public Schools, which, the great education I got in Ankeny is one of the main reasons I went into education. I had great teachers throughout my experience, and I just wanted to do the work that they were doing. So education has always been super important to me. Now, when it comes to kind of the culture wars, I was very active in competitive debate throughout high school, which exposed me to a lot of ideas that, you wouldn't traditionally find in the high school curriculum. A lot of philosophy and critical theory that most 16-year-olds aren't thinking about or even aware of, critical race theory was something I was reading back in high school. And I was also very into various feminist theories through my work in debate. And that led me to Drake University for my undergrad, where I majored in English and secondary education and minored in women's studies. And one thing that I am really proud of with my Drake experience is that women's studies minor was very much designed to be intersectional and international.
Okay.
You hear a lot of people, especially today, complain about white feminism, and that has never really been my experience when dealing with feminist texts. Even in my intro to women's studies class, we're reading bell hooks and Audre Lorde and other important Black women that are making significant contributions to our understanding of gender, of sexuality, and of race. And so kind of thinking about intersectionality and how different identities relate to each other, interact with each other, became an important part of my academic background. And then, of course, after Drake, I started teaching in the Cedar Rapids School District, which was a wonderful experience and very eye-opening to me. Mm-hmm. It was truly the first time in my life where I had been confronted with working with a diverse population of people, of students. And there was a lot of room for me to grow throughout that. I had this great background in gender and women's studies. It had an intersectional approach, but even when I started teaching, I wasn't really comfortable talking about race in the same way that I was comfortable talking about gender or sexual orientation. And so there was a lot of growth that had to go through there, especially when I started teaching classes like sociology or geography or US history, where kind of race is very much a central component to a lot of those discussions. And that also brought me to get my master's in the school's culture and society. At the time when I did my MA, I was more of a philosophy focus.
Mhm.
And then 2 years ago, I went back to work on the PhD in the same program with a history focus. Very interested in the ideas that we would now call the culture wars. When I think of the cultural wars, I think of, especially as it pertains to education, probably there are 3 or 4 big questions that the culture wars are about. What is getting taught? Who is getting taught? Who is doing the teaching? And what role does the community have in working with education? So all sorts of different experiences that led me to this current interest of the culture wars in education.
Awesome, awesome. I did want to clarify something. You talked about being introduced to critical theory and critical race theory in high school. As you know, that's one of the biggest debates around the country right now, is this notion that critical race theory is being taught in our schools. Can you kind of clarify how and in what context you were introduced to those concepts?
Absolutely. Like, by no means was critical race theory ever actually taught to be in high school. With competitive debate, you have to be prepared for all sorts of arguments. And even when I was coaching, I always explained to parents that the work that we're doing in high school competitive debate isn't very similar to graduate level work in terms of the materials we're reading and working with. And just to be one of the race is always going to come up. We had a topic about education. And it was one of the topics I debated in high school. And privacy was another one of the big topics that we debated. And actually, just kind of how critical race theory developed. It actually started for me in high school with critical legal studies on the privacy topic, learning about critical legal studies um, through just the arguments that are being made in the extracurricular activity. And that led me independently to kind of get into Bell and Delgado and Crenshaw's work with critical race theory.
Awesome. Thank you very much. I can tell you something you probably didn't know. Did you know that I was certified as a debate coach? Never did
No.
it, but that was part of my undergraduate experience. I think that that particular program is a program that should be more embedded in schools because of the exposure, because of the skills that students learn through preparing for those debates. But I also understand that that is a lot, and not all students are ready to take on that level of educational experience. But I'm really glad that you had that experience while you're in high school. And
And
go ahead.
oh no, I totally agree. And actually, I know this might be a little bit of a side, but several summers I actually worked at a summer debate camp specifically for students in the Milwaukee public school system.
Oh, interesting.
Um, and I was actually working with a lot of students that had reading difficulties or learning disabilities that wouldn't traditionally make debate kind of challenging. But we actually found lots of ways to engage struggling readers and students that hadn't had that hook into school because they got the feeling of like, hey, this is cool. I'm talking about things that my peers aren't talking about. I'm learning about things in the world. And there's actually some really, really great research out there about how debate is actually one of the best interventions for struggling readers. So,
Well, since we're on this topic, actually, when I ran a summer program, I used to show my students a debate documentary about these students from Oakland that I think they came in second in the nation that particular year for their debate. And it's kind of like their backstory and where they came from, and then how their teacher had created the debate program in their school, and how that had opened up so many avenues for them that they didn't even think was possible, because they got this great exposure. They learned these wonderful skills, and more importantly, they gain confidence in themselves as
Mhm.
being able to be critical thinkers and critical speakers to issues that, like you said, adults are dealing with, and that are kind of outside their normal lived experiences. So I'm right there with you in saying how important that kind of educational experience is, and how we our system by and large is not necessarily taking great advantage of those kinds of enriching experiences for students who are not doing well in the more typical traditional sense. They
Mhm.
get it, they understand. I mean, for them, it's personal. It's super personal, and they can bring a lot of richness to those debates that other students just don't necessarily have, and because of it, they can actually win real, get into, that's their entree into college and into internships, and all kinds of doors open in those situations. So that sounds really great. I completely agree with you.
Absolutely. Debate is a great activity for kids to get involved with at all levels.
Absolutely. So many educators are concerned about the current culture wars and the impact on public education. In your scholarship, how are today's issues an iteration of the Philadelphia Bible riots of 1844?
Well, thanks for asking that, Valerie. When we think about the culture wars, a lot of people will turn to actually a speech that Pat Buchanan gave in 1992 at the Republican National Convention, where he is talking about a lot of the same issues that we're talking about today. And culture wars, I mean, I would argue, have always been involved with education in particular. We've always been asking those same 3 or 4 questions, and sometimes those asking those questions in our public settings has some very frustrating and even extreme outcomes. Um, and so I like to look at the Philadelphia Bible riots as just kind of a good indicator of what could happen when there are disagreements about what we're teaching.
Mhm.
And not a lot of people are familiar with the Bible riots of 1844. Sometimes you'll hear them in the literature be called the nativist riots.
Mm.
Um, so, like the name suggests, this took place in Philadelphia. Philadelphia was at the time predominantly a Protestant community, as most of at least New England and maybe the middle colonies or former middle colonies were.
Mhm.
But starting in the early 1800s, we start seeing an influx of Irish immigrants into Philadelphia in particular, until they get a fairly sizable population. This is actually even before the potato famine. The potato famine starts in 1845. So these are people that are migrating mostly for job opportunities in the United States. We're not really worried about the famine pushing them out yet. But they're establishing, the Catholic Irish folks are establishing themselves in Philadelphia. And just as we see throughout US history, there's never there's never really a love for the immigrants that are coming to a community. And this is a time where, I mean, this is really kind of before the construction of whiteness, but the folks that were already living in Philadelphia wouldn't have seen the Irish immigrants as white. They
Yeah.
wouldn't have seen them as part of their community. But as their population grows, they start gaining some influence within the community. Within the early labor movement, actually, the Irish immigrants start kind of establishing unions in Philadelphia.
Mm.
And the Protestant community that's already living there, who see themselves as Native Americans, a phrase that they would actually use.
Right.
Um,
Like native Iowan.
yes, yep. um, they start really getting concerned. They actually form a political party early in 1843 or 1844 on a pro-nativist agenda, keeping the immigrants out and making sure that we use WASP, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant community, kind of maintains their majority in power in Philadelphia. Now, at the time in education, we're still a little bit early for what we would call public schools today. I'll probably just still say public schools so people understand.
Right.
They function pretty much the same way, maybe a little more competitive. There's
And
not compulsory,
exclusionary.
yeah, like very exclusionary.
Right.
There's not compulsory education at this point. Actually, Philadelphia had the second high school in the United States. It was open by this point, but we wouldn't necessarily recognize it as a high school. We would think of it more as a college. They actually are, Philadelphia Central at the time is awarding BAs for students that complete it rather than a high school diploma. And so there is very much a system there that looks a lot like our modern public schools. But one big difference is, and this is not just Philadelphia, this is everywhere in the early United States, is they're using a lot of religious materials in their instruction. Particularly in Philadelphia, the King James Bible. Now, this is going to be used for some religious and moral instruction in the public schools, but students are also going to be copying passages. They're going to be doing things like vocabulary building and memorization to build other skills, not necessarily just the religious or moral component. So as the Catholic population grows in Philadelphia, the bishop of kind of the Catholic Church in Philadelphia requests of the school board that Catholic students be allowed to use the Catholic Bible rather than the King James Version. And the school board responds, oh yeah, that makes sense, absolutely. There's really kind of no interest among the school board of like forcing these Catholic students to become Protestant, so they fully understand. Well, unfortunately, some teachers within the Philadelphia system kind of throw their hands up in the air and say, hey, this is too much. I can't teach the same skills with two different texts at the same time. And there's also some community pushback from allowing the Catholic Bible to infiltrate the Philadelphia public schools. So eventually, what happens is individual teachers start contacting the school board. And the school board tells them, hey, okay, fine, you don't have to do both.
Right.
It kind of goes both ways. They tell some teachers you can use just the King James Version. They actually tell other teachers you can use just the Catholic version. And what kind of happens is eventually they start telling teachers, well, if you don't want to use the Bible at all, that's also fine. And the Protestant ministers in the community start getting pretty upset about that. And they start arguing in public that the Irish bishop or the Irish Catholic bishop is trying to take the Bible out of schools, and that they are trying to denigrate the students, like destroy the morality of Philadelphia. And couple this with just the general anti-immigrant push in this city, you get these public speakers, some ministers that start giving speeches around Philadelphia and the surrounding neighborhoods. And eventually in May of 1844, one of these ministers goes to a suburb of Philadelphia that is largely Irish Catholic, and just gives this horrible speech about like reflecting the Catholics are trying to destroy education. They're the wrong sort of people. They're going to destroy our community. There's actually a thunderstorm that goes through the town while he's speaking, tremendous downpour. And then kind of the chaos of that downpour and folks trying to regroup, shots actually start getting fired. And this leads to several days of kind of violent fighting between the Protestants and the Catholics in and around Philadelphia, largely over what version of the Bible that we're going to be using in the public schools. And I see this as very much a connection to today, because, we're not talking, we are actually now again talking about what Bible looks like in schools. But we're very much having conversations about what texts are appropriate, what concepts are appropriate, what words can teachers and educators use in their classroom. And, if you watch some of the school board meetings that have been happening, not just in Iowa, but around the country, some of them are truly getting out of control. And while I think we're fortunate that we haven't seen the Philadelphia Bible riots level of violence, we are still seeing a lot of the same attitudes, that there are kind of two communities that are not interacting with each other.
Mhm.
And rather than interacting with each other and trying to find that common ground, they're having the fights in school boards and public meetings on social media.
Yeah, I would argue that they have armory is different. So instead of bullets, you now have social media and
Mhm.
those outlets of sending barbs across to one another. That is, in many ways, just as destructive physical violence.
Absolutely.
Um, Yeah, I agree with you that that sounds a lot like what we're experiencing across the country and in our schools today, and especially in Iowa. And the rhetoric sounds very familiar as well. Like, who does count? How do we best educate this growing diversity or diverse population into whose interests and who gets to determine. It feels like very much like people are weaponizing these key notions around education to their own benefit, kind of like how the matrix continues to keep people plugged in while using them for power. What are your thoughts about the intersection of the culture wars and education and the current political dynamics we have?
Well, I think one thing that is um, kind of salient to me, I mentioned earlier, with the Philadelphia Bible riots, you had two different religious communities that, had, I would say, both legitimate claims to like wanting their version of the Bible to be taught. And eventually, one of those sides forms a political party. And now it's not just the Bible in schools that they're around. I mean, that it was the American Republican Party. No real connection to our modern day Republican Party, kind of just
Mhm.
their own thing in Philadelphia. Um, but that just formed this anti-immigrant party. And, a lot of, the Bible riots and some of our early culture wars, you see it's different communities of interest that are against each other. But I think what's happened over time is rather than I think political parties, contemporary political parties especially, have adopted those communities of interest. So, which kind of obfuscates a little bit what the actual issues are about.
Yeah.
So now, I mean, I think you mentioned it, that they're using education as a tool to advance a larger agenda. And, education and educators have always been under kind of a higher level of scrutiny um, than their professional counterparts in other fields. And, in many ways, that's understandable, right? Parents are trusting educators to take care of their kids and to teach them 8 hours a day. Parents have to give up some control and put faith in the system. And when they lose that faith for whatever reason, they don't like what's being taught, they don't like who's being taught or who's teaching them, um, there are ways to engage, but unfortunately, we've kind of taken it to a point where political parties become the ways to engage. So, a lot of parents that are going to these school board meetings across the country and speaking about the horrible things that are apparently happening in their kids' classrooms, I would always ask, well, have you talked to the teacher? Have you talked to the administrator at that building? And I think in a lot of cases, there's the answer is no. I mean, here in Ankeny, there's a really good example of a man who actually doesn't have kids in the school district that is constantly going to school board meetings, is actually putting threats of violence on social media about what's being taught at Ankeny public schools. And he's getting that message from somewhere. And it's, since he doesn't have kids in the district, it's not from what's actually happening in the district. It's coming from political pundits. It's coming from social media. And again, it's really about controlling education. And I would even contend, and I think others would agree with me, there's kind of a movement right now to totally undermine, if not dismantle, our public education system.
Yeah, I think about that a lot. As you know, it feels to me like I've done a lot of research about the Great Migration and kind of the white flight and those periods of time in our history, and it feels like we're at that same point with public
Mhm.
education as we were with cities like Detroit and Chicago and New York, where people uh, they they might they might not necessarily be anti-diversity, but they're definitely not comfortable being in close quarters. So they then pull out, and with them goes a lot of the resources, a lot of the access, a lot of the opportunities, and what's left is those who really didn't have the same opportunity to decide to remove themselves, and then then we have this cycle. And the response is then, oh, let's do three strikes laws because we have all this crime, and we have to address that, and it becomes this cycle. I think as a building administrator, that definitely played in school discipline. Who was suspended, how were they suspended, why were they suspended, and then what kind of services then they didn't or did get as a result. So yeah, this feels like very familiar territory.
Absolutely. And, I really appreciate you mentioning kind of white flight. If you look at the geography of where these sorts of cultural war discussions are happening in Iowa, it is largely suburban districts.
Mhm.
Des Moines Public Schools is not facing the same level of scrutiny right now from the community and its parents that Ankeny or Johnston or Waukee is. Ames, or even, Iowa City, I mean, is kind of like a suburban district, but there's all sorts of fun history in the Iowa City Community School District. Um, but it's in places where, the Black population is growing or is relatively new, or there's surprisingly a large number of immigrant communities in Iowa.
Yeah.
And, that's growing in the western suburbs of Des Moines right now. Lots and lots of um, refugee and immigrants moving to the community. And you can see kind of the same processes of white flight happening again. Out,
Yes.
and this time kind of out of the suburbs into what we might call the exurbs or more rural areas.
Yeah. So I do think we have to really pay critical attention to these movements so that we don't make the same mistakes that we have in the past, and we don't continue to reinscribe the same disproportionate outcomes that we have in the past. So what's the solution to this current crisis? How do educators get through these issues?
You know, it's complicated. Uh,
Absolutely.
it is, there's not a silver bullet. Sometimes, as with my training as a historian, I say sometimes say, there's nothing new. I mean, these fights have been going on as long as there's been schooling in America. But at the same time, our educators can't continue working under these conditions. The National Education Association put out a report a couple of weeks ago that got a lot of national attention in the mainstream media, because it says over half of teachers in the profession plan on leaving, if not this year, in the next couple of years.
Mhm.
And that's truly a crisis. We have to make sure that our educators are supported, and that teaching is a profitable, rewarding. Profitable is not the right word, but like we're compensating our educators adequately. And one thing I think that we need to talk about more is this idea of community.
Mhm.
And I think we need, it's great that parents care about their students' education, especially when it's coming from actually concern about their child and wanting the best for their child and their child's friends,
Mhm.
and the neighbors across the street. And I think schools actually can do probably a better job of engaging their parents in proactive ways too. There are great ways for parents to be involved. Pre-K-12, in the elementary school, you have homeroom parents, chaperoning field trips. There are different booster clubs for parents to get involved with, the PTA or PTO. Really positive ways that if schools really invested in that parent involvement, we could kind of bridge that gap between what parents hear on maybe Fox News or MSNBC about what's happening in schools. And instead, they actually see what's happening in schools. So building that community, I think we need a bigger economic investment in our schools. Human services are never inexpensive. And especially in something like education, where there's no such thing as a return on investment. Like that ROI is much more philosophical in terms of like what that individual student or what the community is going to gain 20 years from when we're investing in that student. And so it's hard I understand why a lot of people don't understand why education is so expensive, but it needs to be, because you need to have caring educators, from your classroom associates to your folks working in the lunchroom and bus drivers to your building principals, your district administrators. I have never met someone in education that didn't care deeply about students. And when we are working in this environment where, all educators kind of have a target on their back and they are the problem, and parents, yes, the problem, quotes, and parents are, trying to make sure that their own students get their values instilled, but also forcing the school perhaps to instill those values on other students, I don't blame people that are thinking about leaving education, right? Because, a teacher can't get on social media and fight back, right? They can't say, such and such parent is attacking me, help. Right. It needs to be about building that community between schools, the educators, and the parents. I don't have a specific citation for this on the top of me, but people will complain about public schools being inadequate or teaching the wrong things, but rarely do they actually complain about the schools that their kids go to.
Yeah.
Like they generally, now we're in a little bit different time where they are complaining about their own kids' schools, but again, for things that they've heard on the news rather than that their own kids have told them. Generally speaking, people are happy with the teachers that their students have, the administrators they're working with. It's all those other schools that are the problem. And I think by keeping parents engaged in the school community, investing more in schools, so we can get smaller classes, we can get more associates, we can have folks in administration that are doing restorative practices and really rebuilding that community in the school. And I'm also a big fan of the community school model, which would also put other social services in not necessarily the purview of the school, but would have them available at the school. I'm talking about doctors and dentists and barbers in the school setting, places where students who may not be able to afford to go even to Great Clips to get their hair cut, or going to Great Clips is they're not going to have a stylist that knows how to work with their hair. Right. Getting those services in the school, helping kids get shoes and school supplies, get access to mental health support, really focus the school as the center of community, so that students obviously have a reason to go there, but parents do too. And there are services that parents can get from within the school. But that's going to require a significant investment of money. And, it's going to require parents and schools, from the school board down to the associates, all to sit together and talk about what the needs are. But I think if we have those conversations, folks will realize that 99% of what goes on in schools is absolutely wonderful. And there certainly are areas for improvement. I'm not saying our public schools are perfectly unflawed systems. By no means is that true. But, getting positive parent involvement, and also getting the student voice involved in those conversations too, is a great way that we can really move public schools forward and get past these culture wars and start talking about the needs of the community and helping the community be successful.
Yeah, I completely agree. A lot of the research I've been doing lately, and a lot of my focus in the last few years has been about
Mhm.
communities of practice, where you have various community members, whether they're their parents or even just regular community members who don't have students in the schools, are coming in with the schools as equal partners to craft what that environment looks like, how it feels, and provide those wraparound services, if you will,
Mhm.
so that students get what they need when they need it, rather than having to this school to, for the example you gave, to get their mental health services or their dental services. I do know that it's a little bit like Iowa City did have for a number of years the Safe Schools Healthy Students Grant, which was very much in that wraparound model, where they brought in different, like they had caseworkers and social workers and other folks who were not necessarily traditionally part of the school system into the system, so that they could provide services and supports. But it's complicated in with the kinds of background checks and who does
Mhm.
what, and how, how structure and frame that, so that you're not accidentally opening the doors to the big bad wolf,
Mhm.
which is another. I mean, that is also a very big community concern, that not just anyone has access to our kids, but
Absolutely.
yeah, but communities of practice are definitely, I think, in the next 20 years, we'll see a lot more schools as communities of practice
Mhm.
than we currently have, because it is one of those ways of involving everyone and having everyone have an equal footing in that involvement, and not being just acted upon, but also being able to act or have some more agency and autonomy in that process. Yeah, you have been open about feeling an obligation to resist. Why is this important for you, to disrupt or resist the status quo?
I think we get oftentimes trapped in our own thinking.
Mhm.
And um,
Another reason why you need communities of practice.
yes, and we need to resist misguided attacks. We need to resist, I would say, political control over our schools. I'm very excited about talking about, school boards are nonpartisan elections, they're nonpartisan positions. And the purpose of that is to focus on the community. In the past couple election cycles for school boards, these elections have become hyper partisan. And I think that's actually a site of resistance. We need to resist the partisan nature of school elections
Mhm.
and elect people that care about the community and care about all the students in that community. And you also have to resist your own biases. And I sometimes I have a bias that public education is the great social leavener. Um,
Me too.
and sometimes I have to resist my own thinking there and look at the times, both in history and some practices now, where that hasn't been the case. Canada right now is dealing with their Native Canadian boarding school crisis, where they're finding in Canada Catholic boarding schools where a lot of Indigenous Canadians were either forced or kind of tricked into sending their kids to these schools, and they're finding mass graves. And we have the same things in the United States, except they were run by the government, by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And, Carlisle Industrial School is probably the best example or most infamous example of this. And hopefully, I know our Department of the Interior right now has said, yes, we are going to go investigate the history of these schools, because there were some awful things that happened in the name of education, in the name of Americanization. And we need to address that. And we need to realize that, yes, there have been and are problems in public education. but acknowledging that instead of just having these rose tinted glasses that I sometimes have is important to advance public education to be what it could be to help prepare our students for living in the community that they're going to be living in.
Well, I mean, as you know, I have young men and out in the world, and I fully expect that their life's journey will take them to different places in the world. I know my middle son has already been to China and back, and would love to go back to China.
Mhm.
Not because there's lots of things I can say about that, but he has enjoyed his time overseas, and I expect that my youngest one will also have some living and working situations where he's overseas as well. We don't know at this moment. We don't know what 20 years, what the economy is going to be like, what the
Mhm.
job market is going to be like. So we do have to prepare students for a future that we can't necessarily envision, but we know, as we're experiencing now, that it's going to be more of a global focus than it ever
Mhm.
has been in our history. We I agree with you. We can't necessarily look to the past to find all of the components of what the future will look like. I think we can lean on the past in terms of really standing by the compulsory education, really standing by the notion that we need to educate all students, and
Mhm.
really standing by the things that we do as public institutions to ensure that we're giving everyone access and opportunity. Those to me have always been the gems of our educational programming and process. But at this moment, it feels like we're at this critical juncture where I'm not sure it's going to continue the way it has, because of all of the acrimony and all of the disagreement and all of the concerns around what it looks like, and who, as you said, who counts as being part of that population of the educated, and who counts as being part of that population of the educator.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. And, I think we do need to also be paying attention to that second question, who counts as being an educator?
Mhm.
Um, I mean, because there's, a lot of things that we look at, again, as things that were good for education
Mhm.
actually had some very troubling consequences. And one of those things that I would actually turn to when I talk to people about this is Brown v. Board.
Mhm.
Brown v. Board, which theoretically, not necessarily in practice, but theoretically desegregated schools,
Right.
also had the unintended consequence of kicking thousands of Black educators out of the profession. Because when schools in the South integrated, those newly integrated schools didn't hire Black educators.
Right.
And we know how important it is for Black students to have Black educators, for all students to be able to see themselves in the teaching force and the people that they're working with. And so thinking about who is teaching, just like we have a diverse student population, we need a diverse teaching and educator population as well. Again, at every position in our school system, our administrators, superintendents, our teachers, our associates, our librarians, we need a diverse community working in schools.
Yeah, representation matters.
Mhm.
You cannot imagine what you can be without being able to see a representative models of what that can be. To your point, I was talking to a elementary school or school principal a couple of weeks ago, and that week she had run across a young lady, a little African American girl, who was really quite upset because someone in her class had said that Black kids or Black people can't be teachers, and she's like, no, that's not true. And the kid said, well, look around you, who are our teachers? And that like just hurt her. And
Mhm.
this principal who is also African American, had to explain to this second grader, no, honey, before I became a school administrator, before I became the principal, I was a teacher, and I taught for this many years at these schools. And Black people can become educators. I think you make a great point in terms of when integration, although was the right thing to do at that time. And I would still argue that it is still the right thing to do.
Oh,
It
yes.
did have a lot of unintended consequences that I don't think our society and the communities themselves were really ready for, and that we unfortunately haven't necessarily completely accounted for in how we look at who is in education, and what role do they play, and what sense of voice and agency they have. I know I've been listening to a lot of different not social media, but voices of educators across the country and a couple of different platforms, and I'm quite stricken with the amount of uh, educators of color who are saying, you know what, I believe in education, but I think I'm going to go and start my own company. I'm going to do some consulting instead, because there isn't room for them to have the same kind of autonomy and agency that their white colleagues are afforded, and it's frustrating. And not only that, they're kind of lumped in with the, this is the problem of education, is people like you.
Mhm.
Um, and there isn't a lot of support or even awareness that this is a current thing in 2022,
Mhm.
you know.
And, to yes, and that is like LGBTQ educators as well. Um, GLSEN has done, the GLSEN does their biannual report about the status of LGBTQ youth in schools. And one of the consistent findings that you see throughout that is one of the biggest things that um, helps mediate or prevent LGBT youth suicide is having an adult in the school that they can talk to, that they can be out to, and that they feel a relationship to. And so part of that is we need to allow educators to be out about their sexual orientation or their romantic orientation, and to be those positive role models for kids that can be there to talk, or just be like, the Trevor Project, it gets better. Seeing that there are successful LGBTQ individuals in education in their community that are proud of who they are, and they are authentic with their students about that, so that students can kind of develop that positive self-identity as well.
Absolutely, it's critical. I think, again, representation matters, whether that's racial representation or gender identity representation. It's across the spectrum. If we want to show students how to use their grit for their own educational journeys, we have to be able to have models in front of them that
Mhm.
they can at least see and get to know, not necessarily emulate as much as know that they're not alone.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So if people were interested in learning more about culture wars in education and kind of the history of that, what are some resources you would recommend?
So kind of one is a contemporary about kind of our current moment.
Mhm.
That is it it is A Wolf at the Schoolhouse Door: The
Mm,
Dismantling of Public Education and the Future of School. And that's by Jack Schneider and Jennifer Berkshire.
okay.
Jack is a historian of education, and Jennifer is an education reporter. They actually have a podcast they do together called Have You Heard? And this is really just a really good, it's popular, so it's not going to be heavy in the academic language, but so anyone can kind of pick it up and read. But Adam Latz is another historian of education
Mhm.
that looks into the culture wars, and looking at things like, especially in the 19 teens and 20s after World War I, where teachers started having to take loyalty oaths and prove they weren't communists and prove they were Christian. And I will send you a citation for that. And then Jonathan Zimmerman is another kind of historian of education whose book is called Who's America? He
Mm.
actually has several books on the topic, but Who's America is specifically about, I wouldn't call it like a comprehensive history, but several chapters about specific culture war type events. And so those are kind of three good books out there that kind of address this. And of course, there are tons of academic articles too, but in terms of the kind of accessible things, those three stand out to me.
Awesome. Well, I really appreciate this conversation and those resources. I'll be sure to link them to the podcast. So I super appreciate that. I think that this has been a great conversation and a very timely conversation, given all the fervor about education and where our country is right now at this moment. This is Dr. Valerie Nyberg, and this is the third episode of Uncommon Voices, Uncommon Visions. I've had the pleasure of talking with Pete Clancy today, and I appreciate your patronage and being able to join us today. So thank you very much, Pete.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for putting these voices out there.
Great, thanks.